Hello, Stay, and welcome back, or for the first time, to Stray Kids, the Megaverse, a podcast of meta-critical analysis where I think too much about 8 strangers who you also think too much about. Today's episode song is Red Lights. It will become very obvious in, 15 minutes why Red Lights is this episode's theme. I want to try a bit of an experiment with this episode one. I guess they're all experiments at this point. I have most of this episode mostly scripted out, but what I've found is that scripting can help, but over-scripting is a problem for me. So we're going to do a combination of ad-lib and scripted and see how that works for me. So this episode is about personas. I thought a lot about what the first real episode should be about. I have many ideas that I'm very excited to discuss, but I did realize that I need some base introduction episode to the fundamental theories that I talked about in the introduction episode, the short introduction. I determined I really need an introduction episode around personas, themes, storylines, and the state of the meta, and to describe more in detail what I mean by them. I'll admit, I wasn't very excited to do this episode when I first started writing it. I don't think that personas are the most interesting part of my theoretical orientation on, I can't believe I just used the words theoretical orientation to talk about a fucking K-pop band. Whew. Oh God. Personas are not the most interesting part of my theoretical orientation, in my opinion. But actually, as I started writing it, I became more excited by this episode. But the concept of personas, in my mind, is still like the concept of load-bearing walls and 2x4s. I don't think it's one of the more interesting things that we can talk about. You know, if we're sitting in a really beautifully built and decorated home, it's just not the most interesting thing to ask, what are your walls made of? Which ones are load-bearing? How many 2x4s? But it's also literally foundational to the house. I did realize very, very quickly as I started trying to think through things in organizing episodes and what we need to build, that if I didn't explain my theory of personas, simply nothing else made sense at the level of depth and analysis that I want to do. I found that I reference personas very frequently. They essentially build out the characters or archetypes provided by the band in all the other content that we engage with. So this episode is about how I conceptualize the 3 main different personas, archetypes, that we see honestly not just from Stray Kids, but many K-pop or J-pop bands, especially in the era of social media. You might disagree with my conceptualization, and I would certainly be interested in hearing how you'd adjust it, but this will give us shared language for the rest of the podcast. So let's get into it. I want you to imagine a single spectrum in a straight line. This is an unfilled gradient. We will segment that gradient. All the way to the left, we have what I call our staged persona. A staged persona is not necessarily a stage persona, though a significant amount of what happens on stage will be part of the staged persona. A staged persona, though, is basically the persona, the identity, the character an idol presents for highly planned and scripted content. This might include music videos and choreography, a massive percentage of what happens during a concert or even sound checks. To an extent, some of the actual music written, and even some of the interviews and variety shows, especially short interviews of one person. This first segment of the spectrum, the staged persona, will take up a fifth, maybe a quarter of the full spectrum. The next segment will take up most of the visible spectrum. This is our public/social persona. This is for any and all non-staged content that is planned, created, edited, and or made accessible to the general public. This includes just about everything that we consume of SKZ's content, whether that's lives, vlogs, socials, SKZ code, which while I recognize there is a stage around, most of it is not planned staged content, right? Bubble, fans, many interviews, hell, even airport departures fall into this. If it takes place in the public eye, but they have not literally created a script or choreography for it, it belongs in this segment. So this segment takes up the majority of our spectrum, probably 60 to 70%. Now, at the end of the spectrum, that last segment, it doesn't end with a hard cap, but it fades into the distance. There's a filter over it that gets more and more obscured as it goes on. This is our private persona. It fades to indicate that we don't know really what it looks like or how much of the spectrum it is at all. We do not know for any one idol how much of their private persona is visible to us. Unless you are close enough to these boys that they are telling you their secrets, we will really never know what their private persona looks like. And ultimately, most of the time, it's not worth speculating on. You see, it is true that for most people, there is a public and private persona. And for most people, unless you're close enough to know some of their secrets, you don't really know the difference between those two personas. However, with most people whom you know in life, you can decide that you want to get to know them well enough to see that private persona. This is where the parasocial relationship starts to get really out of control. When we want to get to know the private persona of someone we don't know, so badly that we forget that we don't have access to that information. And in this situation, we cannot just decide to try really hard to have access to it anyway. Mitigating the impact of the parasocial relationship involves reminding ourselves that when it comes to the private persona, we don't know and we can't know. We can be told some things, and we can decide whether or not to believe those things, but we cannot know with our own senses and bodies. And it is, the vast majority of the time, presumptuous, misleading, and an invasion to try to know. There are a few of extremely important and notable exceptions to the statement of the vast majority of the time. Sometimes public figures will tell us about their private persona through communication that requires reading between the lines, which is to say that sometimes people engage in coded language, coded communication, whether verbal or not, that is meant for specific in-groups. However, those exceptions are niche, usually rare, and both complex and complicated situations. We will explore that explicitly in future episodes, but for now, the long paragraph short is that, for the most part, the private persona is something that I consider to be a heavily obscured area that imposes automatic failure in all ability checks that involve having insight into it. So, we have our spectrum of personas with their 3 segments: staged, public, and private. Now, in building an empty spectrum, we might create hard lines between each of those. But it's important to note that each member is actually going to have gradients, and those gradients are going to look different for each member. So that is to say, between the staged, social, and personal personas, those gradients may be smoother, may be harsher. I'm going to give a couple of examples for the sake of developing the shared language. But this episode isn't for analyzing the different persona spectrums of each member. I might do a deep dive on some of them at some point, but it's not what I find most interesting in the analysis. Again, I'm not super fascinated in analyzing why strangers behave the way they do. And it becomes very hypothetical at some point. But again, for the purpose of shared language, I'm going to go into a couple examples. I'll do one example of someone who has a very distinct difference in their staged and public persona, and one who has like a hardly visible gradient between the two. So there's one interview, I don't remember which one. I'm pretty sure it's one of the Summer 8 era ones. I'm pretty sure it's one of the recent ones as of when I'm recording this. But in the interview, it's asked the group which stray kid is the most different on and off stage, and the very quick answer was Hyunjin. This was my quick answer too, based on the content we're given. I think that it's a lot of people's quick answer. And I think that he's leaning into the differences more and more as the years have gone on. Hyunjin has a very distinct staged persona, And it is radically different from the public social persona that he has. Hyunjin's staged persona has been for a while, and increasingly so, based in a really intense, just raw sex appeal. Red Lights wasn't his first exploration of this by any means, but I'd argue that it was his first, really notable example of this. Maybe the Play with Fire video. I wasn't stay at the time, so I don't know what the immediate response to that was. But Red Lights had sticking power to it. So this is obviously where the Red Lights comes in, right? Because now I have to go on a Red Lights tangent. This isn't a music analysis podcast because I just don't think that anyone can do justice to close reading Stray Kids lyrics without being fluent in both English and Korean, which I said last episode and I will continue to say. But I think it's really relevant to this conversation, and honestly, I would love so much for somebody who is very fluent in both Korean and English, who has some music analysis chops, who understands the slang as well, to do some real music analysis. Please, for me. Anyway, Red Lights. The reason I think that Red Lights is really relevant to this conversation of staged personas and private stage personas, public personas, and private personas, especially when we're talking about Hyunjin, is that there's something about it that feels really like it speaks to the dichotomy of how he portrays himself in general. There's a trope flip in it that I think is actually really beautiful from an artistic lens. God, I'm autistic as fuck, and I also have a minor speech impediment that makes it really hard for me to say R's. So the word artistic is wildly difficult. I feel like Han every time I say it. So there's a trope flip in it that's really beautiful. And I mean, I think the entirety of Red Lights is, it's gorgeous work. There are many songs in this world that are on their face about, say, driving or, trains, but those songs are actually about sex. Sometimes it's as obvious as the fact that every song about a moving vehicle is about sex, and sometimes it's a lot more subtle than that. What's less common to see in music, at least, is the reverse, or the inverse of that. But we look at something like Red Lights, it's on its face about sex, and not just about sex, but when put in the context of the music video with the lyrics, it's about a very dominating, addictive, controlling form of sex. Right, it's on its face, Red Lights is about BDSM. It's not trying to hide that, right? That's what it's saying to us, is this is a song about sex. But it's actually about something much, much deeper. It's something that, yes, has a seductive quality to it, but the sex and sensuality is the facade. While it's always hard to say what art says about the artist, we can usually say that it says something about them. The not quite close reading of Red Lights is that it's about overworking yourself, right? But more importantly, when we put it in context of the artists, overwork is literally performance and the obsession that goes into being a performer. I have to wonder, considering the timing of when Red Lights came out, how much he had been thinking during his hiatus about what it takes for a performer to keep their fans and to be loved. So we have the overwork, the over mental taxing, the over dedication of that parasocial relationship, the parasocial relationship that they have with us as well as what we have with them, portrayed through this dominating, addictive, controlling sex. You layer those two things, and they become layered in such a fascinating way, because there is this dichotomy. Yes, on its face, it's about the literal act of sex. But then what is it to be performing as a sex symbol? That is a read of it, is you are overworking yourself as a performer. And Hyunjin performs as a sex symbol. That is his staged persona. Red Lights really just has this beautifully artistic, sensual, and I almost want to say sex restrained, in that sex feels like this too small box that something dreadfully poignant is like trying to break out of, but the sex-oriented song. There's this push and pull of whether the author is in control or is being controlled. That feels so relevant for a young idol who really hasn't lived a life with true independence ever. And in addition, having that quality, Hyunjin has spoken about working really hard to break out of this idea of being the visual, but then still embracing, he hasn't spoken about embracing that sensual side of him much, but like he clearly has tried to, sort of take that back. And again, that too small box, right? That he at some point was forced into as an idol and wants to break out of. I do think it's notable that Hyunjin primarily wrote the song and was obviously very deeply involved with its choreography and direction and concepting. From where I sit, Hyunjin's personas are very reflective of this experience, of that push and pull, of that control or being controlled. He has this highly sexualized staged persona, and that's something that can either be liberating for a person or can be confining for them. I get the sense that over the years, Red Lights came out 3 years ago at this point, he has tried to find ways to be in control of that persona rather than controlled by it. I know I said that was a quick Red Lights tangent. It wasn't. Because it is relevant, and also because I love Red Lights. But yeah, so Hyunjin's stage persona has clearly really been drawn, he's clearly really been drawn to exploring emotive sensuality on screen and on stage. And that emotive sensuality over the last several years has also expanded sometimes to just like pure sex appeal. More and more he engages in pretty clear fan service. For instance, there was a recent concert in Sydney where he seemed to be responding to a fan sign asking if they should have his lips or ramen for dinner, with, well, the obvious answer for someone whose staged persona has become essentially to be the fuckboy of your dreams. Which, like, get it for him. Nothing wrong with that, if that's who you want your staged persona to be. But he's really seemed to lean into it. He does not portray that at all in his public and social persona. It is fascinating to watch the way that he would talk about red lights with Chan. In his conversations about it, he's like almost shy, like Hyunjin gets bashful about it in a very different way than how Chan does when he's in that public staged persona or that public social persona. The staged persona has basically nothing to do with the persona he puts out in anything other than these highly scripted and contained environments. Which again isn't to say that there is no sense of sensuality or sexuality in anything else he does, but it's just really not the primary vibe that he puts into the universe. In some ways, I think that that's why lines like, and oh god, the way we all just paused the video and stared into the far distance with this one. But like that line in SKZ Code where he told Felix, you're the only guy to make me crawl, in one of the recent ones. Wild of him. But I think the hard distinctions between his staged and social personas are why him saying things like that becomes so infamous almost. We all know that he has this like running sexually charged persona, but he doesn't actually bring it into that casual content very often. If Seungmin had said that line, I don't think it would have felt as shocking to so many people, because Changbin's social persona is also wildly flirtatious. We could say, if we look at the persona spectrum of Hyunjin's, his staged persona segment is filled with this like deep red, with hardly any transition or gradation to the vivid white of his social segment. But like sometimes we just get one pixel streak of that red bleeding suddenly over, and we're like, what? Oh, is there a gradient? Did I miss something? And it just feels like kind of shocking. Considering his age, I am curious to see how that evolves over time. For many, many people, their early to mid-20s really involve exploring what sex means to them and what it means to them to display sexuality and sensuality. In some ways, this is the real benefit of the staged persona. It's a much safer place to explore identities, behaviors, expressions, etc. There's a reason why so many queer, neurodivergent, and otherwise marginalized people become so attracted to theater and similarly staged artistic forms. It's not that there's something inherently queer or neurodivergent about theater, it's that theater, and to an extent, writing, music, fashion, dance, etc., provide this outlet to directly explore identities that are otherwise unsafe, confusing, or unsupported to explore in life. It allows those of us who don't quite mesh with the society we exist in to put on different outfits, right? Different emotional outfits, to put on different experiences and ask ourselves, is this it? Is this me? Is this a part of me? Does it feel good to let it be a part of me? So, okay. Hyunjin gets our award for maybe sharpest line between staged and public personas, at least for now. On the flip side, we might look at, say, Seungmin, who I'd argue has a pretty clean gradient between his staged and social persona. Like, I'm not even sure how much of a gradient it needs to be. Like, are those Are those two different colors? Like, no, they definitely are two different colors, but it's like the difference between a coal black and a blue black. I think he embodies his personal confidence a little more on stage. He has more of a cool guy persona in his staged content. But to me, at least, his staged personas and public personas read as very, very similar. We do know, if we generally believe what they tell us, that there is a gradient between the public and private, though. So, for instance, while Skiz Code isn't staged content, that's not the personas they're embodying there. There's still some scripting. It's still built for engagement and entertainment. It's like it's fairly close to staged content on our spectrum. Like it's only a hop, skip, and a jump over from that line. And it's not infrequent that this closeness is admitted to, right? There are various times when Stray Kids or the editing staff will break that fourth wall. And Seungmin has said that in Code, he's often looking for, if the content isn't going as well as they'd like, he'll like infuse some chaos into it. He's also said that he's become more chaotic due to the influence of his members. So while his qualities of being a bit of a menace exist very clearly in staged and social content, the closer to that staged content whatever he's doing is, the more he really embraces that menace aspect. You know, the interviews where they probably mostly know the questions ahead of time, more or less. The things like Code, things where there's a goal and there's a purpose and it is made for entertainment. He clearly embraces that. But it's been made very clear, I'd say largely through kids' room content, but also somewhat through interactions on Bubble and some of the less like planned or edited moments that we see on stage or otherwise, that he's like actually a very gentle soul. He plays and he jokes, but it's clearly very important to him that he doesn't actually cause real strife. Which isn't to say that he doesn't, right? They've all sort of talked about accidentally pushing and pulling too far. Seungmin is very autistic coded. He's not a fake character, but like there's a lot that reads like that to me. And this is one of those things, right? That sort of constant push and pull between like, how do I inject humor? How do I be fun, but without going over the line? Seungmin, like, really, I think, does sit on the other side, at least again from what I've seen, but sit on the other side of how harsh that gradient is from Hyunjin. It does seem like probably there's a gradient into his personal persona, but we really don't know, right? We only know what we're told, which implies that, but that's all we can know, and that's fine. Those are the two big examples. So when I say staged persona, you now understand what I'm talking about. When I say a social or public persona, you now know what I'm talking about. And when I say a private persona, which I don't expect I will very often, again, it's really not worth deeply assessing. But when I say private persona, you'll know what I mean there. Whew. All right. I have no more script, so I'm assuming that means that I'm ready to end the episode. I don't know what past me's life goals were, but present me cannot recall wanting to talk about anything else except more analysis of red lights because I love red lights. Y'all, I know everyone keeps asking for red lights too, but like I'm anxious. I'm anxious about red lights too because I don't know that you can like purposefully do that again. I don't know. I'm going to choose to trust them, but like I just it feels like bottling lightning. But I don't think talking about red lights is valuable anymore. I think I've done what of that I need to do for this episode. So stay. Oh gosh, no, it's time for me to ad lib a bad pun. Do I need an ad lib a bad pun about red lights? Okay, yeah. Okay, wait, I've got it. Okay, stay. It's been great talking to you. If I haven't already made an Instagram and Threads account by the time I post this, but I will have, you can find me on Instagram and Threads. I don't know what my username will be by then, though. So you'll figure it out. If you enjoyed this episode, or you have other reasons that you would like to overthink Stray Kids some more, which I know you do, then I hope you keep going like it's a green light and not stop like there's a red light. Oh God. Okay. I thought that was a good idea. It wasn't. It was a bad. I need to have more confidence with these ad-libbed bad sign-off puns. Okay. Keep on keeping on. Love you. Stay. Talk later. Bye.